Welcome to yet another episode of History Time. It is November, and 6 years ago, on 8th November, we had what was known as demonetisation. Suddenly, there was an announcement that all of us who had 1000 rupee notes and 500 rupee notes had to take them back to the banks and get them exchanged for 2000 rupee notes and 500 rupee notes. It took the entire nation by surprise, and even today, there is a lot of debate on what exactly was achieved by that demonetisation exercise. Was it positive? Was it negative? The jury is still out on the whole thing. And it was said that such a move had never happened before. But then history is a strange creature. It suddenly shows you that there is nothing new on this earth. 300 years ago, a demonetisation exercise was attempted in Madras city. Let us see what happened then. Before we go on to that story, we need to understand what were the currencies in use at that point of time. The Vijayanagar rulers employed gold coins on which on one side they had a temple tower or a gopuram, and on the other side they had the boar, which was their emblem. The coin therefore came to be known as the Varahan because of the presence of the boar on one side. When the Europeans began to come to India, they on the other hand chose to speak of the coin with reference to the gopuram that was on the obverse side of the coin, and they named it the pagoda because in their terms the temple tower was known as a pagoda. The pagoda remained the coin in circulation for a very long period of time in South India. At the same time, in the north, where the Mughal emperors were ruling, you had the rupee. And the rupee was valued at 11.5 grams of silver. The rupee was a silver coin. And there was no exchange between these two, at least formally, because there was no diplomatic relations between one side and the other. But in reality, there must have been plenty of trade with a lot of these coins being exchanged one with the other. This went on for quite some time, and then the Vijayanagar Empire weakened and the entire South India was taken over by the Sultans of Golconda. Later came the Mughals in the 17th century, and by 1685, practically the whole of South India had come under the Mughal Empire. That was when, for the first time, the question of a formal exchange between the rupee and the Varahan or the pagoda came to be discussed, and eventually it was arrived at. But the Mughals, for some reason, decided not to displace the pagoda or the Varahan and decided to keep it as the currency in South India. They established a number of mints all over the region where the coins could be struck. At the same time, the European powers also decided that minting coins was a profitable business, and so they decided that they would approach the Mughal emperor. Enormous bribes were paid, and eventually the Portuguese established a mint in San Thome. Later, the Dutch established a mint in Pulicat or Paraverkade. The British established a mint in Fort St. George, and the French in Pondicherry. All of them began striking coins in the name of the Mughal emperor. They also had other coins that they produced. Unlike today, where a coin produced from any mint in India has the same value as a coin produced in another mint, that was not the case during those days. There were enormous variations in gold content, quality of gold and silver, the alloy, and therefore there was an informal exchange rate among the pagodas themselves. People began to speak of the pagodas in terms of the mints where they were produced. So there was the Tiruvallur Pagoda, there was the Arni Pagoda, the St. Thomas's Pagoda, the Madras Pagoda, and so on, and the Nagapatnam Pagoda. There were so many of them. And there was enormous confusion in the market. To sort this out came up an entire breed of businessmen, the people known as the Shroffs or Sarafs or the Sahukars. They settled in the northern part of Madras in an area that they would give their name to, Sahukarpet, even today. And they would finalize the exchange rate. The East India Company in those days was paying a tribute to the Nawabs of Arcot, and that had to be paid in a completely different pagoda known as the Arni Pagoda. And you can imagine what kind of confusion would have prevailed. But outwardly, it all seemed very orderly. The pagoda or the Varahan itself had the Fanam or the Panam as its subcoin, and that was 42 Panams to a pagoda. And then, and here my memory really fails me because the confusion is so much, the Panam itself comprised of 4 paisa. 1 paisa was 2 duddu, and 1 duddu was 10 cash. These were all the denominations of currency that existed at this point of time. And what is interesting is that one pagoda was not equal to the other pagoda. Everything depended on the mint where it was being produced. To add to the confusion, the Chinese began sending counterfeit coins on board ships, and they entered Nagapattinam and began to come into circulation. As a consequence, the value of the pagoda began to fall. In 1735, the East India Company in Madras came to a decision. It would produce a new coin with a security feature. This was known as the Pagoda. On both sides of the central figure, there would be an M. The M was supposed to stand for Madras. The coin would be produced in the Madras Mint, and then the public was asked to bring their pagodas and get them exchanged for the Pagoda. In those days, not many people would have had coins with them, particularly gold coins. But those that had went to the mint and decided to get it exchanged. The mint, incidentally, was not on Mint Street. The mint originally was in Fort St. George, and then it travelled all over. It went to Chindadripet, it went to Lingichetty Street, it went back to the fort, and finally, much after this demonetization episode, it came to where it stood on Mint Street. And then in the 1860s, that mint was closed and it became the government press. But to go back to the demonetization exercise, in 1735, the public lined up with all the coins that they had in order to get the Pagoda. But then what happened was exactly what happened in 2016. The Pagoda was not available. The gold that was supposed to come for minting it did not arrive. There was a huge shortage of the Pagoda. People had to wait. Eventually, the coin was produced and the new coins came into circulation. What happened then was even more confusing. The surrounding areas, which were not under the control of the East India Company, refused to accept the pagodas. People began to go back to the shroffs, who began to melt the pagodas and give them in return the old pagodas. To top it all, the Nawab of Arcot refused to accept the tribute in pagoda. He insisted that it should be paid in the Arni Pagoda. The East India Company had no option. It called back all the pagodas, had them melted, converted them into Arni Pagodas, and paid the tribute to the Nawab of Arcot. The Pagoda, therefore, had a very short life. And as H.D. Love, the first historian of Madras, writes, they spent their entire lifetime in the fire. They were melted, made into coins, the coins were melted and went back into gold. This then was the story of demonetization in our city. It was as confusing as the later demonetization. Things don't change, do they? I'll soon be back with some more interesting stories from history. Bye for now.